Today I wanted to discuss what is probably considered rather gauche among modern thought and in particularly around discourse in a civil society. So violence, as I've spoken about before, has become quite a faux pas and is seen as being an unnecessary evil in the realm of peace and prosperity that we live in, and that any occasion and instance of violence is something that's very disruptive because of how it's making those who are accustomed to peace be very disconcerting for them, and they are very concerned. Which is to say that I think it's worth analysing and discussing a little bit about how, as Faustian Teutonic men, we've formalized and how we were considered, to begin with, savages and barbarians by the Romans, and we made violence sacrosanct around how we performed ritualistic violence as opposed to war, as opposed to how it reflects on individual honor and the defense of your own property, etc. I think it's important to remember that there's always a sacred and religious element to the Western Faustian concept of violence, and that it is adversarial in a romantic way, particularly seen with how formally it's been understood that we can engage on certain pretenses and regulations. So I think it's important just to understand that when you talk about the honor of battle, chivalry and valor, that reflects certain expectations around the actual undertaking of violence in a very contextual way. The way we can kind of micro examine it is through the duel, and how that one-on-one, mano-a-mano, is a dictate around a lot of personal pride, but also reflective of your blood, strength, and your favor to the gods. And this can then be extrapolated or ballooned up to a battle, a pitched battle between two tribes, two armies, where we can still see the sense of romantic underpinnings, and in this, as I would like to say, a hallowed view of performed violence in this way. It's almost theatrical in the way that it's been staged. We want to tap into probably what is the competitive nature of ourselves, but also how we deem fighting, and that whether that's a fight, as I say, against ourselves or our one-on-one opponent, or as a band together against another band. I think it's worth having a look at both angles, or you could say both ends of the spectrum, and how the duel, being romantic and necessary for one facet, kind of mirroring almost the purpose of war, or at least battles on a grander scale. I wanted to maybe kick off some of this with a quote here from Spengler, as the underlined quote here. "The protocol of parliamentary debate resembled that of a duel between noblemen. Like the music of the period between Bach and Beethoven, it was based on the perfect mastery of formal principles. As soon as this formalism was abandoned, the music became barbaric. Today, no one is able to dash off an old-style fugue as could the classical composers. It is also with the fugue-like form of parliamentary tactics. Coarser people, coarser questions, and it is all over. The duel becomes a brawl. The institutions, the sense of tact and cautious observance of the amenities are dying out with the old-style people of good breeding." Now, you can see that even in his day, the 1920s and 30s, that parliamentary debate had started to shift and was performed, as he says, more coarsely because of the denaturing or the abandonment of principles around gentlemanly conduct, which tied directly to, I would say, violence, in a way that you can only say things that are potentially outrageous or extreme if you're not willing to back them up with violence per se. Then you can grandstand, and this is one of those slow developments with how dueling fell out of favour quite heavily. It was obviously punishable by death in France because of how popular it was up until the 16th century, but the way that we can consider a man and his word and his bond interwoven, and this you almost call it indestructible principle that if you did violate your word, it had comeuppance associated to it, versus today when lying has no gravity almost when it comes to whether or not you say something has any repercussions for you personally, and thus it's quite easy to spout off certain nonsense and then have it not boomerang back into you in any form of consequences that are very material. This, I would say, is the one-to-one degradation of a man who, particularly in parliament or politics, has lost his notion of honor or valor, because there is no representation of violence to the position other than internationally, where political schema and interactions from diplomats have a very direct relationship with violence, particularly for war. So I think it's still not lost internationally, but definitely domestic politics has become very feminine in that way. I think it's important to understand how deeply entrenched or imbued we are with this sense of dueling as a necessary component to life. So even in the Iron Ages, but also the early Germanic periods with the Goths, and then further on to the Viking Ages, there was a ritualistic dueling, you might want to call it a ceremony, but almost religious experience, whereby you would duel in front of the gods against someone in a holmgang or in some other formalistic ritual duel. And that could be over disputes, it could be over property, it could be over personal regard and whether or not you've been offended by calling someone a cur or demanding satisfaction. But even still, I think it's important to understand the historical necessity of a man to fight another man, and how it's been regarded as a very logical and rational piece of our social fabric, and that even Otto, the Holy Roman Emperor, was able to condone dueling in the late 10th century because of its core attribution to Germanic and Gothic tribal instincts. We can see it manifest interestingly in ways that allow us to understand martial prowess as a form of prestige and status, and obviously with the existence of a judicial champion, we understand that it was necessarily in law to enforce either your dispute in a way that could be martial and violent, rather than necessarily allowing law to flourish as an intellectual exercise. You would have a dispute being able to be settled by either you or your champion in a duel with a certain set of outcomes reflecting if you've been killed or you were defeated. And I think there's something very almost beautiful but romantic in that way, that we can consider the judgment of God or of the gods in general as divine retribution or divine instruction around guilt or associated victor in a legal framework, and whether you had to pay weregild or any money towards the death of a family member or something like that of the duelist. And there's a lot of interesting considerations around dueling that I think we now lost. There's no way to formally have duels nowadays, so there's no way to settle disputes, and in fact I think you would find most men cower at the thought of a duel and any physical harm being done to them in any way that would require them to risk bodily autonomy. And that's to say, if you're not willing to have violence done against you, then it's just indicative of your inability to perform violence in a way that is manifestly powerful and strong and threatening. So you're also admitting defeat in the realm of what we might call actuality and the reality that you live in. You've already surrendered to what is your own will, and which is obviously the first layer of fight that you need to be taking if you wanted to develop yourself, I think, from my perspective at least, as a complete and holistic man. The notion then of whether you had a Hersier or a champion and fighting the best for the best is obviously a spectacle, so there is an element to it that people will watch and enjoy it, which I think we have just transposed onto other games and sports. So say if you're out watching a rugby match, there is an element of violence attributed to the game and the sport that we allow ourselves to express just by virtue of, well, maybe it's a not of our own volition, but if we do it vicariously, say, then there's still an element of stress and escapism around the violent aspect, which we like. This, I think, is based on this fulcrum of a threat of death and honor, and how it's simultaneously interlinked, where we will have this notion that a victor, so the loser will be dishonored and the victor will have honor, but also the threat of the loser having death and the victor having life and property and prosperity. It's very, I think, instinctual and natural in that way. It's also a good reflection of our will to will, so the two combatants of almost supernatural will versus will, and that the bodily form of that is almost just the simulacra of two wills clashing, which is once again this very almost magical realm of, can my spirit defeat your spirit? And in the manifestation of this bodily formation in this time, whether you've been training, whether you've been eating or sleeping, and how you lived your life is a culmination in events to this one pitched battle, where you go from having a duel to potentially a tribe versus tribe battle, and then the multiplication of men and force just garners more and more, I think, importance, which is why we can start to see wars being of spiritual importance, and that we're pledging ourselves to Odin and to become a Einherjar in death, in battle, with an axe in our hand. And why there have been and are cults around war, from the Teutonic Knights, but to berserkers, to Ulfserks. There's a lot of different cults that relate to war and wartime. And once you have a formalization, and we call this probably professional war, where we went from having men who sought out to be warriors to then having to conscript in these large battle of the masses after Napoleon's rise, where culminating in World War I, we just have an efficiency to war. There's no duels per se. The death and the killing is all faceless. It's artillery shot across a battlefield. It's men in trenches, blinded, trying to stab each other with trench shovels and bayonets. There's no romanticism there, and you can see in the pictures down how it must have taken a lot of psychological power for a man to know he would have to go into battle in full suit of armor, and then wrestle and stab and wreak havoc amongst his enemies in a very personal way, versus in World War I, where you can see men dying by the thousands from unknown enemies shot into shrapnel above them, and just dying where they lay in this really ignominious and ignoble way, which is obviously something that we should be embarrassed and ashamed for, because I think there's no larger tragedy, and not even in a romantic sense tragedy, just the flat out horribleness of what war had morphed into, and that there's no sagas sung and no death odes except those of the more sonorous and epigrammic ones around our fallen comrades, because they were missed and they were lost in wars that weren't won in name of honor rather than in some political games, which is obviously why the notion around war has changed, and that we are a society who no longer values it in a way that allows men to be forged. There's no young bloods going out ritualistically to garner their respect or being inducted into these warrior cults. What we have is just a society where you can sign up to go be an administrative soldier and sit in your arse all day, filling out paperwork or pushing crates around a warehouse. And we still have the need, and you can see this in German universities with their Schlager or their Mensur, where fencing is still seen as a ritualistic threat, but also this honor-bound social activity, where performing something dangerous against another man has a different type of life feeling associated to it that can't be matched with, say, arguing, debating, or wrestling, or even boxing. I think there's something to it with a sword that we've naturally been inclined to feel as if it's necessary as an extension of our wills into this manifested point. And then you can see this with the depictions of duels across the ages, where it's very bombastic and, I think, serene in the way that we've depicted men struggling for life or death in a very romantic, we're clothed in fanciful garb, and then also having people spectate and obey rules around what's allowed and what's not. So as I said before, it's very pageantry almost in the way that we've considered to be such a core ritual for those noble men, and that nobility is almost derived from this natural physical prowess. It's something akin to knowing it's more like the cost of something without having a price for it, and the cost being your life for honor. And there's no price you can put on that. And even with the judicial champion system, where you have elected a champion, his death still meant the punishment for both you, him dying, and you now having the court's opinion of you as to be guilty. So I think that there's definitely for the champion, a supererogation around attaching his own duty to such a high level to someone else's honor that it almost supersedes his own soul's preeminence. So you've come out of body to represent almost conceptually this champion in a way it's very both interesting but also deep and profound, I think. And then I think lastly, it's maybe good to understand how this progression has led us to now me here, but also talking to you, romanticizing the extent in which we both miss and yearn for duels, but also how important it was to show that might is right in such a visceral way. Starting here with just a quote around old German and Teutonic cults, saying that the single combat later duels in fact were believed to be decided by Tyr, or just divine powers later on, who gave the victory to the righteous, a divine sentence. So being very spiritual, but also tying it directly to the gods observing us and rewarding us for our great deeds. And that Caesar and Tacitus report that the Germanic tribes settled their quarrels by single combat with swords, and with the Germanic invasions the practice became established in Western Europe early in the Middle Ages, as I said before with Otto, and then all the way up until King Louis banned dueling in France. It was pervasive, and it was just a necessary function of having a noble level of society. And I think it's almost best encapsulated by something called the Battle of the 30, which was as it describes a battle between some 30 knights from Britain and from England, Brittany being in France, around the ownership of a whole kingdom. And then that's to say that this battle, and you can see here, was fought with swords, daggers, spears and axes, mounted or on foot. It was the most desperate character, and its details very reminiscent of the last fight of the Burgundians in the Nibelungen, especially the celebrated advice of Geoffrey de Bois in his Wounded Leader, who was asking for water. "Drink thy blood, Beaumonier, thy thirst will pass." So you could see obviously this very, not stoic, but proud and valorous men, knowing what they fought for was transcendental of just violence as an expression of frustration or anger. And this is why current mechanisms in society lack an outlet for this, and that these, you could call them plasters or piecemeal fixes, are not sufficient to really to embrace exactly the Faustian need for this duel, this combat by trial or by combat, where we are being pushed into this fire and seeing if we're made worthy or not, and that the real test of our actual soul, and there is nothing currently in existence which gives us that feeling, unfortunately. So my recommendation, at least for you, is to at least embody what the knightly aspect of training and betterment would have been to prepare yourself for an eventuality where you might need to have a trial by combat, should it arise, not that you'd obviously elect for it to.